Hey Star Surfers, Surfer One here, coming to you again from Between the Proud Lions. In this video, I'm going to be doing an overview of the astrology for March 2025. And then after that, I'm going to be doing the rising sign horoscopes for all 12 of the rising signs. Now, I started putting out videos last month, and my intention was to start putting them out much more regularly, doing a lot more than I have been doing. But as fate would have it, my life took an unexpected turn and had some unexpected turn of events in my life, as so often happens, and I just was not able to sort of hit the ground running like I thought I was going to. And it's actually been a good thing because it's given me time to kind of recalibrate sort of like the output that I can feasibly be doing. I set a really high bar for myself, and I kind of had to sort of like readjust that. So I'm definitely going to be doing monthly videos, monthly overviews with rising sign and sun sign horoscopes, and maybe try and do like weeklies as well. But I'm just gonna keep it there for now and see how it goes. I'll also say that I think some people were a bit confused in my last video about my voice. Let me just say that this is not my real voice. I'm running my voice through a modulator. I sound very
different in real life. Listen, basically, I have a small stellium of planets in Scorpio, needless to say,
I highly value my privacy and my anonymity, and the idea that at some point in the future, should these videos start to get more viewers, the idea that anybody would recognize me out in public from these videos and want to come and interact with me in that way is kind of like my idea of a horror movie, to be honest. I highly value my anonymity and my privacy, and so I want you guys seeing as little of me as possible, hence the glasses and the voice. Sorry about that. I enjoy doing the videos. I enjoy putting my ideas out there and, making the videos. It's a very creative outlet for me, but I don't really like putting myself out in public in a way that would be so recognizable. So hence the voice and the glasses and all that. And I'll also say, before I get into it, I know some people were also a bit confused about the way I am naming some of the planetary archetypes, like Saturnia and Neptunia. I do plan to be doing videos on that and going in depth on that, kind of like pleading my case as to why I'm doing that, making my points. I do have reasons. I mean, basically what it boils down to is kind of like, I think when you really think about what this planetary archetype does, it's a yin malefic. It stops, it withholds, it freezes. These are all yin things, yin sort of maleficent things that it's doing. Mars is the yang malefic. Basically, kind of what it boils down to is astrology is coming out of this patriarchal world where they just couldn't really even imagine giving the female archetype an equal footing, just like in any way. It's not the world they were in. They just couldn't even understand that. They kind of begrudgingly had to give the moon and Venus a place just because they couldn't get around having them be men. They just had to have them be women. If they could have had them be men too, they probably would have done it. They begrudgingly let the moon and Venus be women because there was just no way around it. Virgo doing a woman, governing over women too. But beyond that, it was a man's world, all the other things, so they made Saturn an old guy. They made Saturn Kronos, the old crotchety man. But when we really think about what this planetary archetype does, to me, it's not an old man. So I conceptualize this planetary archetype not as this Saturn, the crotchety old man, but as this Saturnia, the wise old crone. That's how I conceptualize this planetary archetype, as Saturnia. I also conceptualize Neptune as Neptunia, a yin female archetype, as well as Pluto as Persephone or Pluto. Again, a yin female archetype. So that's just what I do. It's how I think about it. It's how I'm going to be referring to those archetypes here on this channel. So thank you for bearing with me on that. Hope it's not ruffling too many feathers, but I know it's a bit different. All right, so let's get into this. So right at the beginning of the month, on the 1st, Venus goes retrograde in Aries. Now, this is always significant. It's always, a big thing when Venus goes retrograde. It doesn't happen. It happens sort of regularly, but not that regularly. So it's always of note, always very impactful. A lot of, changes coming through at that time. But this is particularly powerful, and there's a particular importance on this Venus retrograde, which I will explain. I'm going to circle back around to that after I do the whole overview. I'm going to circle back around and pay particular attention to the Venus retrograde. It's really a Venus-Mercury conjunction retrograde, which I've gone back and I've looked at sort of like historical significance associated with this aspect, and I'm going to go into more detail about that. But first I'm just going to sort of get through the general overview. So Venus goes retrograde on the 1st. The next day, the moon, Luna, is void of course. Now, I wouldn't normally mention a void of course moon. To me, it's not like the most significant thing. It happens very regularly, but it's generally like a couple hours. And honestly, I just haven't really like looked into it that much and kind of tested it out myself and sort of like seen how it's working with other people to like really feel like I have enough to comment on it. I do know that a lot of other astrologers do put a lot of weight on it and say that it is a significant thing. Things started during that time can really just like not come to fruition. There can be problems with it, that kind of thing. General rule of thumb people say is not to start something during that time. The reason I'm mentioning it now is because the moon goes void, of course, depending on where you are, either early on the 2nd, or if you're sort of farther east in the world, it's going to be later on the 2nd, more into the 3rd. But it's void, of course, for almost an entire day, almost 24 hours, basically. So it's a very long void, of course, and just mentioning that in case maybe like not the best day to kind of like start anything big. On the 11th, there's also another pretty long void, of course, moon. It lasts about 12 hours, so half a day. Mercury conjoins Venus in Aries. Mercury is not retrograde yet, but will soon be going retrograde right after the eclipse, which is 2 days later on the 13th. That's the full moon. The full lunar eclipse from Virgo and Pisces. And Sol is also conjunct Saturnia at the same time as this eclipse. A couple days later, on the 15th, late on the 14th and into the 15th, Mercury stations direct with Venus in Aries. So what this is it's kind of like once Mercury goes retrograde, once Mercury goes retrograde, Mercury and Venus are now both going retrograde, but they're conjunct. They're like So they're basically doing their retrograde motion together the entire time. They're never more than a few degrees away. It's this sort of like Venus goes into Aries, has been in Aries, and it stops and goes retrograde. Then Mercury comes in and stops, and then they both go back together. It's a Venus-Mercury conjunction retrograde. And it's very important, it's very significant. Again, I'm going to circle back around to that. But it's almost, to me, more significant than the eclipses, or sort of on par with the eclipses. They're all kind of part of one thing, highlighting this sort of momentous time we're in. And it's sort of these rare alignments that don't really happen that often, because the Venus-Mercury conjunction retrograde, it doesn't happen very often. It happens only a few times a century. And it's happening now. On the 20th, Sol goes into Aries and pretty much immediately starts conjoining Venus and Mercury, who are retrograde. On that same day, the moon, Luna, goes out of bounds once again, bringing in some sort of heightened emotions at that time, on top of everything else. And there's another kind of interesting aspect between Mars, who by that point is at like 22 degrees Cancer, trining Uranus and Saturnia. Sextiling Uranus and trining Saturnia. Saturnia is sextiling Uranus. So it's this mini grand trine between Mars, Uranus, and Saturnia from Cancer, Taurus, and Pisces, which is pretty activated once Mars gets into that 22nd degree. On the 27th, Venus goes back into Pisces and immediately conjoins Neptunia. And the 28th is basically Luna is sort of like flying through Pisces as well, and kind of pinging everything there as it goes. On the 29th, then there is the partial solar eclipse at the same time that Mercury goes back into Pisces as well. And the last really significant thing after that, on the 30th, is Neptunia then going into Aries. And that's kind of, the marathon is over at that point, at least for another month. So the main things this month are the eclipses on the 13th and the 29th, and then the Venus-Mercury retrograde, which is, to me, kind of tied together. They're really part of one thing. They would normally be very separate things, but they're happening right around the same time, and the way in which they're happening, that to me, they're really part of the same thing. The astrology of March is really one of those times where what's happening in the sky and in the chart is so loudly reflecting what is happening in our world. In the United States of America, we are currently in what is basically a hostile fascist takeover of the government by a handful of oligarchs. There's a handful of the richest people in the world orbiting around Donald Trump, and they are just sort of trying to like consolidate as much power around themselves as quickly as they can. It's really a coup. We're in the middle of a kind of like fascist oligarchical coup, and people are really starting to like wake up to that and see that. And even like many Republican people, there's sort of like rumblings of like, oh my God, like what have we done? You know, we sort of like let the genie out of the bottle. You know, you have all these Republican people that were like voting for Donald Trump, and even they were kind of like not really prepared for what's happened. And what are eclipses? Eclipses speak to exactly what is happening now. they speak to huge momentous moments for entire groups of people, nations, rulers, powerful rulers. And we're having these eclipses at this time when basically like the role that the United States of America has held for much of its existence, and certainly the last century, is now basically dead. It's completely changed now. Besides like a handful of, diehard MAGA Donald Trump supporters who are just like drinking the Kool-Aid and just sort of like whatever happens, they don't care. They just love Donald Trump, But I think at this point there is sort of probably a majority of American people, even like Republicans who voted for Donald Trump and weren't really like expecting all of this. And certainly like from most people like in the rest of the world, certainly places like Europe and sort of like more developed places in the world are, really looking at coming to this understanding that the United States of America no longer sort of holds the position that it once did for much of its existence, and certainly like the 20th century. Much like when the Soviet Union collapsed in the the late 80s and early 90s, it was this clear sort of like, okay, this thing that it once was is now like no longer, and it's now transitioning into this other thing. What we're seeing now, okay, maybe it's not like, it looks different than that, but there is kind of a sense of like something fundamentally has changed here in the United States of America. It's no longer that we're not going to really be able to like go back from this. It's too much. It's too extreme. It's crossed this line, and to now like there's no credibility anymore. The credibility is completely lost. There's just no trust, and the leadership of the United States of America, that's a fundamental shift in just sort of like world politics. And we're seeing that happen now in real time with this hostile oligarchical takeover of the United States government, and how the rest of the world is kind of like responding to that. And like I said, coming to these conclusions that like, look, we can't really trust America anymore. We need to start sort of like figuring other things out. Europe is talking about that. This is what eclipses talk about. This is what eclipses do. They sort of shine a light on these moments. But to me, what is even more interesting about March is the Venus-Mercury retrograde. Now, it's not uncommon for Venus and Mercury to interact with each other in some way during a retrograde. Mercury goes retrograde very often, Venus less frequently, but still frequently enough. So it's pretty common for Venus and Mercury never get that far away from each other. So it's common for Mercury, while retrograde, to sort of like retrograde over Venus during the retrograde. Still pretty common for them to be retrograde at the same time when Venus goes retrograde, because Mercury too goes retrograde so often. It's generally pretty common for when Venus goes retrograde, at some point during Venus's retrograde, Mercury too will be retrograde. Less common, but still kind of a common occurrence, is for them to be retrograde at the same time and kind of close to each other. And when I say close, I mean like maybe in the same sign or the next sign over. But if in the same sign, say like Venus at like the end of Leo and Mercury at the beginning of Leo. So in the same sign, but like 20 degrees apart. So definitely not a conjunction. Like close-ish, but not that close. What is very uncommon is for both Venus and Mercury to be in a conjunction the entire time that they do a retrograde together. Now, there's a lot of other people, other astrologers who have spoken about Venus, about Mercury, about their retrogrades. Ariel Gutman is a well-known astrologer who has, written books about this, about the Venus retrograde star point. So I want to acknowledge the fact that I'm likely not the first person to talk about what I'm about to talk about, but I've never heard anybody else talk about it, and I've never read anything about it. Ariel Gutman, one example, could very well have already, written about this. I haven't read her books. I've heard a lot of her talks, seen a lot of her interviews. I've never heard her talk about this. But that being said, it is highly likely that someone else has already, noticed this and spoken about it. I just have never heard them do so. So what I'm saying now is just coming from my own observations, but I do want to acknowledge that, it's highly likely that this is not like an original thought. So the entire 20th century, the 1900s, this Venus-Mercury conjunction retrograde happened 6 times, only 6 times. And it happened in 2 clusters. So there was a cluster of 3 from 1945 to 1951. April 1945 in Aries, 3 years and 3 months later in July 1948 in Cancer, 3 years and 2 months later in August, September of 1951 in Virgo. Then there was a gap of 33 and a half years before this happened again. And then there was another cluster in between 1985 and 1991. March 1985 in Aries, 3 years, June 1988 in Gemini, 3 years, August 1991 in Virgo and Leo. Again, another 33 years before it's happening now, again, this month. So this is rare. This is like a twice, and I'm really looking at these clusters as kind of like one thing. It's a period. So these periods of these Venus-Mercury retrograde conjunctions, I have not done exhaustive research on it, but I imagine the pattern is sort of more or less the same if you keep going back or keep going forward. These clusters only happen twice in a century, basically. So they're rare. And that's significant. And I've just been thinking about what does this mean, and in terms of this moment, and in terms of sort of how this has shown up in the past, and sort of what these 2 planetary archetypes mean. And just to further clarify what I mean by these Venus-Mercury conjunction retrogrades, well, it's exactly what is happening right now this month, which is rare. And what's happening is Venus has gone into Aries and is now slowing down and is starting to go backwards on the 1st. At that same time, Mercury is coming into Aries and meeting up with Venus and stopping with Venus at the same place Venus is, within a couple degrees, and Mercury too then starts going backwards, and they both start going backwards together for the entire time that Mercury is retrograde. And then Mercury, because Mercury stays retrograde for a shorter period of time, will eventually in Pisces start going forward, and then Venus starts going forward. But it's that conjunction that the entire time, so Venus goes retrograde, then Mercury meets Venus, they both go retrograde, Mercury ends, Venus ends. The entire time that both of them are retrograde, they are within a few degrees of each other. They are conjunct the whole time. That's the rarity. And the meaning of these Venus-Mercury retrograde conjunctions that happen in clusters, so that we got the cluster in 1945 to 1951, and then 1985 to 1991. 3 of them. So there's 1, 2, 3, a big gap, 1, 2, 3, a big gap. What do these clusters mean? What's happening in the world around these times? I think, and how does that apply to right now and what's happening right now, and what is this going to mean for us going forward? the meaning and significance of this can really be seen through what Venus and Mercury represent in astrology. Venus representing women, being one of the main representatives of women in astrology. Mercury, pretty much always in the past, Mercury was described as, Mercury is non-binary, okay? Mercury is like the non-binary archetype in astrology, but they didn't have any way to describe that. They were trying to describe that in the past, but they just didn't have any language for that because they had no kind of like conception of that in their patriarchal world. So they said things like Mercury's a shapeshifter, and, you know, Mercury goes here and there, or Mercury's a child, or, you know, they sort of like could kind of see what Mercury was. They could kind of see like a non-binary person there, but they just had no way of like really acknowledging that. So they used these sort of other, they kind of like tiptoed around it because that's all they could do. But nowadays we would recognize, okay, Mercury is non-binary. Mercury is sort of like gender non-conforming, or like however, you know, some form of like non-traditional gender expression is Mercury. Let's say non-binary. Mercury is non-binary, okay? And so as a result, Mercury is kind of the representative of, we could just say, like, queer people in astrology. As far as I'm concerned, you know, Mercury does represent, Venus represents women, Mercury represents people of sort of non-traditional sexual orientations and gender expressions, queer people. And what does it mean when Venus, the representative of women, and Mercury, the representative of queer people, meet up and go retrograde together in a conjunction? I think this coming together in a conjunction and doing a retrograde together, they end up sort of representing not just women and not just sort of people of non-traditional sexualities and gender expressions, but they basically they take on this kind of like social justice signification. Any group of people that was sort of like not the main sort of group of people in power, you could say. And, you know, so marginalized people sort of like on the edges who weren't sort of like, didn't have much power, you know what I mean? They were kind of like pushed to the side and kind of put in the corner. That's who Venus and Mercury in this conjunction during their retrograde is signifying. They did it in the from 1945 to 1951. What was happening in the world? It was World War II. But World War II basically ended in 1945. But World War II basically ended in 1945 at the time that this Venus-Mercury conjunction retrograde cluster started in 1945. So what happened during World War II as it concerns women and like racial minorities in the, let's say, talk about the United States of America? They were, for the first time really, allowed to sort of come in and occupy positions in society that they had not been able to do so before. There had been women's movements, there had been the suffragist movement for decades before that, but it was World War II that really allowed women to step into positions of power and sort of do things in the workforce that they had never been able to do before, certainly on that level. It was done out of necessity. It was done for a bad reason because of a war, but nevertheless, it was people who had been, to that point, very marginalized, were now stepping into positions of sort of bigger engagement and power within society. Again, it was done out of necessity, but it still happened nonetheless. So the war ends, and what happens? You have all these, you know, white males who had gone off to war come back home, and what do? They expect to just, you know, be the ones in charge again. You know what I mean? And so it's the end of the 1940s and the 1950s in America, and really for much of the world. And Europe was in shambles, but let's just talk about North America here. How was that for women and racial minorities and gay people? They were basically told to go back to the corner. It's like, okay, the war is over now. Thanks for the help, but go back to the corner. Go back to the kitchen and just do what your husband tells you, and stay behind your white picket fence. And so it was the 1950s. It was a very regressive time, pretty oppressive time for women, for people of color. You know what I mean? It was just sort of like the white man wanted to be the one in charge again, and everybody else who wasn't, a straight white male just basically were being told to get back in the corner. So it was a regressive period for those groups of people, represented by the Venus-Mercury retrograde conjunction during that period of time. So it was a regression for those groups of people, but it was temporary. We know that, time moved on, and then the 1960s, there was sort of, the gains that were made all along never sort of went away, but they ended up coming back again. The 1960s was a very liberating time. Things progressed, things moved forward. Women, racial minorities, gay people started to come back out into the open again, sort of gaining more power, gaining more momentum for themselves. In the 1960s, the 1970s, until we hit this second Venus-Mercury retrograde conjunction cluster from 1985 to 1991. What was the defining thing during that period of time, especially for those groups of people? It was the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And who were the people that were most heavily impacted by HIV/AIDS in the late 80s, when it was at the peak of the kind of runaway? There was no cure. There was no any kind of prevention. Nothing. It was gay people, primarily gay men, and people of color, and even a lot of women who had adopted a more open sort of sexual lifestyle as well were being impacted. It was not just those two groups of people, but those groups of people represented as sort of marginalized people, being represented by Mercury and Venus, especially in a conjunction, were once again, during this cluster of conjunction retrogrades, went into a regressive period because that virus forced them to kind of slow down and stop. People weren't going out as much. They were sort of keeping to themselves out of necessity of not wanting to die of this virus. So people weren't as open. There weren't as many sort of the liberation that many people found during the 1960s and 1970s was challenged during that time because of this virus and because of the political response to it. The Reagans, and they wouldn't even say AIDS and stuff. And it was this very sort of so it was these marginalized groups of people were sort of met with a regressive, challenging period once again during the late 80s and early 90s. But as the 90s go on and into the 2000s, at the turn of the century, again, HIV/AIDS has kind of gotten under control, and it's not a death sentence anymore. And kind of life goes on, and people sort of come back out of the shadows. And, then there's RuPaul's Drag Race, and sort of women are really, really not having it anymore. Eventually it's the Me Too movement, and people are just not having it anymore. They're just sort of fed up, and it's no, we're gonna have a seat at the table, and two men and two women are gonna be able to get married whether you like it or not, and people really making even more gains. You know what I mean? It's a progression. Time goes on, and these marginalized, Black Lives Matter the marginalized communities that have always been told to just stay in the corner were really making big gains in this 33-year gap period between 1991 and right now. So this month, March 2025, marks the beginning of yet another of these Venus-Mercury retrograde conjunction clusters. There will be, there will be, again, 3 of them. March 2025 in Aries and Pisces. Then 3 years from now, 3 years and 2 months from now, in May 2028, there will be another Venus-Mercury conjunction retrograde in Gemini. 3 years or so after that, so 6 years from now, about 6.5 years from now, in August 2031, there will be a third Venus-Mercury retrograde conjunction in Leo. And then there won't be any of those for another 34 years. So we are entering into another one of these, what is likely going to be, if not a full regressive period, a challenge period for marginalized communities, which seems to be the storyline that is always coming through during these Venus-Mercury retrograde cluster periods. Marginalized people, represented by Venus and Mercury, conjoining and going retrograde together in these clusters, seem to represent a challenge to these people. We're already seeing it. The right, the extreme right of the world, the MAGA people in America, many countries like in Europe, Hungary, Viktor Orban, these sort of authoritarian, old school, white, male figures who want to sort of drag everybody back like 100 years ago, and they really want to just sort of hold on to a certain type of power. They are kind of not going out without a fight, you know what I mean? It's like happening right now. They're just sort of like dead set on just like, if they're not gonna be able to get, stay in power, then they're just gonna like go out kicking and screaming and just wreck the place on their way out, you know what I mean? That's what we're seeing right now. So it is likely, a challenging time coming for women and queer people and people of color. Likely a challenging time for those marginalized groups of people. So it is what it is. I mean, it sounds very depressing, but we're in a crazy time right now. We're in a crazy, pretty extreme time, and it is what it is. And the astrology is reflecting that and really speaking to that very loudly. And to further emphasize and accentuate this Venus-Mercury retrograde conjunction is the moon, is sort of what the moon is doing this month, separate from the eclipses. So on the very day, around the very time that Venus goes retrograde on the 1st, the moon comes into Aries and makes an exact conjunction with Venus at the moment that Venus starts going retrograde. Just further pinging and highlighting that moment. The moon keeps going at the same time that Mercury comes in. So by the time Mercury gets conjoined with Venus, the moon has gone around and is now does the eclipse, and then a couple days after the eclipse, the moon makes an exact opposition with both Mercury and Venus at the same moment that Mercury goes retrograde. So the moon is just highlighting both of these retrograde moments as they're happening, separate from the eclipse. But listen, I don't want to scare anybody too bad. We always have to keep in mind that even in the past, during these challenging times, and speaking now specifically about the Venus-Mercury people, the marginalized people, progress never really stopped or was completely abated. Progress still went on. It might have, gone underground or sort of like slowed down. It was met with a challenge. There was a slowdown, but it never really stopped. It always sort of eventually came back out, and progress continued, and gains that were made in the cycle before were never like fully lost. They remained and were still there to be built upon. So we are going into a challenging time. There will likely be some kind of challenge that needs to be met, especially concerning sort of traditionally marginalized groups of people. Women, people of color, and queer people are going to really be challenged during the next few years. It seems clear that is going to just continue. It's already happening. The astrology is speaking to that, and it will be a challenging few years. But we have to keep in mind that it's not the end of the road. It's not a dead end. We will kind of like come out of this, but it is going to be a challenging time. And, we have to be sort of like aware of that and ready to do what we need to do to stand up for ourselves. All of us, not just these groups of people, but anybody who doesn't like authoritarianism. You know what I mean? Anybody who doesn't like a group of fascist oligarch billionaires thinking that they can run the world. We all have to like be ready to really stand up for ourselves, because that's really kind of what we're being called to do. We're not really being given a choice, basically. It's either that or just sort of roll over and let them like steamroll over everybody. I don't plan to do that. Okay, so I'm going to get into these rising sign horoscopes and see kind of like what's going on, how it might be more like specifically applying to people based on the rising sign and what houses it's happening in. But, definitely keep in mind that this does feel like a time where kind of like a few years ago in 2020 with the pandemic, and where it kind of feels like the mundane, general, sort of overarching events are kind of like getting so big and sort of like dramatic that it's kind of like starting to come into our personal lives as well. Like the political situation is getting so intense and kind of crazy that it's sort of like starting to be felt by everybody. It's not just something that's kind of like happening over there that, we hear about every now and then, but it's sort of like, everyone's sort of like experiencing a similar thing. So it's almost hard to talk about like very specific things, even though, yes, we all still have our individual lives and our jobs and everything. We're all still doing our individual thing, but it does feel like we're entering into a more sort of like collective experience. So that's, keep that in mind as well. But so anyway, I'm going to start off with Scorpio this month. By the way, I do know that the zodiac starts with Aries, but you will never see me start any of my horoscopes with Aries. I'm just not going to do it, okay? Everybody else does that. I think it's boring. So I'm if you want to see people start their horoscopes with Aries, there's plenty of people to watch to see that. I will never start my horoscopes with Aries because I just think it's boring at this point. And so I'm always going to start with something else. So let's start with Scorpio this time. Okay, Scorpio rising. Broadly speaking, all Scorpio rising people are going to have their 11th, 5th, and 6th houses impacted this month. The eclipse is happening in your 11th and 5th house, and the Venus-Mercury retrograde is starting in your 6th house and going back into your 5th house again. So the south node is now going through your 11th house, and the north node is coming in and going through your 5th house. So this could look like a kind of transition between those house topics, an impulse or opportunities which sort of draw you away from kind of like maybe sort of groups that you have been involved with, and sort of being drawn more into a more private form of sort of how you spend your time. So instead of spending your time in a more sort of public way, kind of like going out and meeting people in sort of more group settings, more of a focus coming in sort of like personal hobbies, personal things you're doing sort of like maybe more on your own. You know, very Scorpio people tend to be pretty private and value their privacy as well. I know that very well. So it seems like this could be like a natural kind of transition that these eclipses are highlighting for those house topics, sort of like really feeling an impulse to sort of go towards more the fifth house, which would be sort of like a more kind of private, personal hobby thing that you're kind of doing on your own. That's just sort of like one thing that's sort of coming to mind for me as a potential this month. And Venus and Mercury doing their retrograde in your sixth house, that could be like some kind of reevaluation when it comes to your health matters. Kind of like an impulse coming in to sort of maybe like reconsider sort of, eating habits and sort of like just sort of general upkeep things that you're doing, or even sort of like what you're doing for work. If you're doing a sort of like a more, like labor intensive job, some sort of focus coming in on that area as well, potentially even a reevaluation with those things. So that's all I have for now. Take care. Okay, Sagittarius rising. You all have been having a lot of activity in your fourth house of home recently, with a lot of the stuff that's been going on in Pisces. Saturnia going through there, a lot of conjunctions with Neptunia going through there. Now the North Node, Rahu, is going in. So you've already been having a lot of like home fourth house activity, perhaps even maybe like kind of like not so stable things happening with that. Maybe a lot of changes already happening for you around the home. Now the eclipse, the South Node is now going through your 10th house, and so the lunar eclipse is happening on the South Node from Virgo in your 10th house, and it's really speaking to sort of even more emphasis kind of like funneling down to your fourth house. You've already been having a lot of activity there, but it seems like some kind of like culmination with how you are in public, how people know you publicly, and sort of just how you are in whatever way out in the world when you leave your house. It seems like there's less of a focus coming through for you on public life, and now more of a focus maybe coming through with again like the home and the fourth house. And there is this mini grand trine towards the end of the month between Mars and Cancer in your 8th house, Uranus and Taurus in your 6th house, and Saturnia, the rest of the stuff in Pisces in your 4th house. And so it looks like maybe some unexpected but not necessarily negative developments around, say, like your work and how that's impacting maybe like your home life and even sort of like money situations in terms of like money you might owe and taxes and kind of debt and that kind of thing. It's looking like kind of like, if you work a job that's more sort of like labor intensive and isn't like, a big like career like doctor thing, like a career job, but if it's more just kind of like regular like labor intensive job, it looks like, if like ducks are in a row in that area for you, might like be some like unexpected, like potentially positive developments around that, which is going to then impact your home life and sort of maybe even like money situation. And Jupiter is it going through your 7th house now, so it could even be like drawing positive things from that. The solar eclipse at the end of the month is happening, moving into your 5th house. So it could be sort of kicking off new 5th house things as well. New sort of creative ventures and hobbies, sort of like even getting, some sort of opportunities around sort of just like fun things to do that you haven't normally been doing, maybe like starting to come up now or like soon as well. So yeah, that's really all I have. Take care. Okay, Capricorn rising. The lunar eclipse is happening in your third and ninth house. And so it is that south node in the ninth and the north node in the third. What this kind of looks like to me is kind of like less of an emphasis on sort of like the sort of broader, bigger kind of ninth house things, and more of an emphasis for you coming in for the more like the smaller scale third house things, sort of like really having more of a bigger role to play in your life, sort of maybe going forward. Maybe like you have been sort of focused on a sort of like broader perspective. The ninth house, sort of like big rituals we do, big sort of like religious things or big travels. It's like this big, but it seems like the emphasis is coming for you and more now on like those smaller ritual things that we do, the sort of everyday things we do around the house to sort of make ourselves feel comfortable, to take on a kind of like ritualistic subtext, short distance travel. So to me, it looks like maybe an impulse coming in for you to sort of focus more on sort of like the locality around you, sort of like right around you, your immediate neighborhood, your immediate locality. And that sort of like, for whatever reason, sort of like taking on a bigger role in your life. That sort of seems like a big potential coming through for you going forward, really, now that the eclipses might be speaking to that. Going along with that is also the Venus and Mercury retrograde in your fourth house, which could be some sort of reevaluation going on with your home matters, which could be tied into the third ninth house eclipse things. And then there's also the solar eclipse happening at the end of the month in your fourth house. So it seems like there is some kind of like reevaluation happening for you going forward to do with your home, your neighborhood, that's really sort of coming through for you right now. And however that might look, but it just seems like those topics are really sort of coming to the fore. That's really all I have. So yeah, anyway, take care. Okay, Aquarius rising. Big emphasis starting for you going forward with your second house money matters. You've already had likely some pretty like intense things happening around your money and resources, with Saturnia going through Pisces in your second house, and all the other stuff that's been going on, Neptunia in the fourth house as well. Potentially sort of like ups and downs with that, maybe like not the most stable time around the money matters. But it looks like there is more of an emphasis coming to your second house with the north node starting to go through there. And, this lunar eclipse in the sixth house, sort of speaking of some kind of like culmination to do with eighth house things. So maybe like paying off a big debt or something like that, which is then like freeing you up to just have more of your own money. That looks like something like that. It seems like it's coming through right now for you. And the other thing that I wanted to say for you was the way that Mars and Uranus are aspecting your second house as well towards the end of the month, making this little mini grand trine between your second, fourth, and sixth house. Looks like could be some kind of unexpected developments to do with the home, which are then impacting your work, which then impact your money. So it seems like there is some sort of like potentially unexpected, but not necessarily negative things coming about to do with the home. Could even be like, good things, like, like, so you thought you were gonna have to, like, spend some money to do something around the house, but, like, turns out you don't have to spend that much money, or something like that. Yeah, so just the main thing is that big sort of eighth house, second house, sort of like debt, personal money axis seems like it's being really, like, coming through right now for you. All right, so Pisces rising. This is a big month for you. You've already been having a lot going on with Saturnia going through your first house, and just lots of things likely going on with that. This lunar eclipse is happening in those important cardine houses of the first house and seventh house for you. The moon is on the south node in your seventh house, and so what this really looks like to me is, it does look like the ending of a relationship, basically. Some kind of important partnership or friendship. There's just no way of, like, really getting around that. That's what it looks like. That's what it's speaking to. It's the south node. It's a lunar eclipse. It's a culmination. It's a culmination of a relationship, or at least, like, a certain phase of a relationship, or even, like, a phase that you've been in, a period that you've been in, when it concerns sort of like maybe an outlook you've had as it concerns other people and relationships, and those kind of, like, important partnerships. So it does look like less of an emphasis coming through for you right now of other people and sort of other people in relationship to you, and more coming to yourself, and sort of a focus on yourself. And then the solar eclipse and your second house kind of kicking off, it's kind of adding to that, along with the Venus going retrograde in your second house, kind of like a reevaluation of your money things, of your resource things, and that kind of linking into this culmination of the seventh house, sort of like partners and other people, and sort of less of a focus on that and more of a focus coming to your first house, yourself, and your second house, your money. So that seems like maybe that's the impulse that could be coming through right now for you, and going forward, more of sort of like a looking inward and sort of like getting yourself together, more than sort of like an outward looking focus on other people. That's kind of what it looks like to me. Anyway, I wish you the best. Take care. Okay, Aries rising. So there's a lot that we might be able to say this month about maybe like your health, kind of like how healthy you are, health routines, and some kind of like maybe even like culmination to do with those issues in your life, with the lunar eclipse happening in your 12th and 6th house. Maybe some kind of like thing you've been dealing with, maybe health-wise, or it could even be like maybe like a job-related thing, like an issue you've been dealing with, coming to some kind of resolution at this time going forward. And that kind of like impacting your first house things, kind of like how you are in the world, how you show up in the world. Venus and Mercury going retrograde in your first house is really speaking to that, some kind of like reevaluation and rethinking about how you present yourself, and how you just sort of like show up in the world, and how that could be linked into some sort of like health matter that is sort of like either being resolved, or you're sort of like taking the initiative to sort of finally resolve, that kind of thing. All of that seems to be sort of coming through with you. So Venus and Mercury going retrograde in your first house, it is big. It does seem pretty important. So Venus retrograde in your first does speak to impulses and sort of sudden changes to do with your appearance. So I'm not saying like don't get that tattoo that you suddenly got the impulse to get. Will you regret it later? I don't know. So I'm not saying don't do that, but there is sort of like an erratic nature to do with Venus, and it's in your first house. Venus already having to do with like appearance things, and it's in your first house of appearance. So it could be some like radical sort of like shifts going on with how you present yourself in the world. Are they things that are going to be like sticking and lasting? Could be, or maybe not. Just something to keep in mind. But anyway, yeah, best of luck. Okay, so Taurus rising, the lunar eclipse happening in your 5th and 11th house does speak to some kind of culmination to do with your 5th house things, like maybe like personal hobbies or like pleasure, sort of like having fun might have been like a big priority for you, in sort of this last period that you've been in, the last number of years. Sort of like having fun, pleasure seeking might have been like playing an important role in your life. And it seems like that might be changing now, and more of an emphasis on sort of like personal fun, personal pleasure, and more of an emphasis now going to sort of like spending your free time in sort of like a more sort of like, I don't know if I would say like more elevated or sort of like a higher level, sort of like being involved in some kind of group that's on some sort of like mission or goal, you know what I mean? It's not just like, let's go out and have fun and that's it, which is fine. But, 11th house is more sort of like higher aspiration, sort of like a group project, some sort of like group affiliation, and you're all sort of like working on something. You're sort of like involved in some sort of like, you're all sort of like doing something that sort of like has more like of a purpose to it. It seems like that's sort of where an emphasis is coming through for you to moving in that direction going forward, which is also sort of somehow linked in with like your 12th house things, with like the solar eclipse happening there and Venus and Mercury going retrograde there. Could be, like opening up a more like spiritual time for you as well. Yeah, so it seems like overall more of kind of like that there is this emphasis coming through for you of less of just sort of like, Taurus, very Taurus people like, their creature comforts and their pleasure and having fun and just sort of like enjoying the moment, which is amazing. But it does seem like there is more of this focus coming on the like 11th and 12th house for you, which are these sort of like deeper, kind of like more elevated, potentially more like serious realms of life. To do with sort of like higher purpose and sort of like inner spiritual work. It seems like that's kind of coming through for you right now. So I wish you the best in that, and take care. Okay, Gemini rising. It seems like you could be moving into a much more sort of external, extroverted, public time in your life. You have the lunar eclipse happening on the south node in your 4th house. So it speaks to some sort of like closing up or culmination and kind of moving away from the private 4th house things, the private home, the sort of staying away, and moving towards the 10th house. You also have Jupiter traveling through your 1st house, which is kind of like lighting you up, bringing a lot of beneficence and luck potentially to, just yourself and sort of how you are in the world, being very sort of, on a good footing because of that, because of Jupiter in your 1st house. And the solar eclipse sort of lighting up your 11th house of sort of groups and hopes and dreams, sort of like out in the world, kind of linking up with this north node in your 10th house. So that looks very sort of like external, sort of being involved out there with other people. Very visible kind of time looks like you could be moving into, and having it, work well for you at the moment. So looks overall pretty good for you. And yeah, wish you the best. Okay, so Cancer rising. Really the big thing for you all this month is Mars. Mars has been on this long journey through your 1st house, going through and then retrograding and now, stationing and now going direct again. So the past few months could have been, felt like kind of, I don't know, maybe like, if nothing else, kind of like a lack of energy, kind of like a drain. It is, happening in your first house. So Mars has been like retrograding over your ascendant, even if your ascendant is in like earlier degrees of Cancer, it's still going to be affecting you. So maybe feeling like something like the mojo hasn't really been there, just like a general sort of like lack of energy, and maybe something you even started, something you were like really motivated to do in a way that you were going to like put yourself out there and sort of present yourself in a certain way towards the end of last year, maybe had kind of like run into some delays. But it looks like now that Mars is going forward again, that is likely to sort of resolve, and you're likely to sort of start seeing more progress in that part of your life, with those things that you may have started late last year. The lunar eclipse is happening in your third and ninth house. And so the lunar eclipse is happening on the south node in your third house. And it kind of looks like maybe some kind of like an ending of a phase in your life where you were more sort of like focused on maybe like you had maybe more of like a smaller scale focus in your life. The third house is like the neighborhood and sort of like things we do regularly kind of like around the house in our just immediate vicinity. It's like a smaller scale part of our lives. And it looks like that if there was sort of like an emphasis on that part of your life, you were just sort of really stuck into like the daily routine. It looks like there's some sort of ending or culmination around that part of your life. And there is this more of an emphasis coming to sort of like bigger scale things happening in your life, especially with like Venus and Mercury going retrograde in your 10th house. It looks like, there will be some sort of like reevaluation with sort of your public life and how you are in the world. And that sort of like linking in with the solar eclipse at the end of the month, which looks also in your 10th house, which looks like it could maybe be like kicking off a new phase in your life where you are being more visible and perhaps even sort of like professional gains, that kind of thing. Also linked in with sort of Mars in the first house, now moving direct, giving you sort of like a lot of energy and boost to kind of like put yourself out there. So it looks like definitely movement going from sort of like small scale, sort of like daily routine kind of things and going more towards sort of like being more visible, perhaps even starting a new sort of like professional chapter or sort of like, starting a new chapter in your life where, you are going to be more sort of like visible out there for whatever reason. That's kind of what it looks like to me. So that's all I have. Yeah, take care. Okay, Leo rising. So you all could potentially be moving into a new phase in your life when it comes to money matters. That's really what these eclipses are highlighting for you. The lunar eclipse on the south node in your second house looks like the ending sort of one chapter in your life where maybe you had like one type of relationship with your money and you're now starting a new chapter in your life, maybe sort of like figuring out a sort of new relationship with your money. And, Saturnia going through your 8th house has been sort of, really motivating you to sort of like get your sort of like money situation on track when it comes to like taxes and debt and that kind of like money you owe. kind of thing. So could potentially have been kind of like a rockier, like more unstable time when it comes to sort of like, that kind of money that you owe other people. The Venus and Mercury retrograde is starting in your ninth house. And so it is kind of speaking of a reevaluation for ninth house things. And one thing that the ninth house can be, that there's a very like political undertone to everything in the ninth house. It's to do with like government, institutions, religious institutions, which have its own kind of like political undertones. It's a very like political house. And so Venus going retrograde in this very political ninth house of yours could be speaking to some sort of like reevaluation, or sort of even like starting a new chapter in terms of sort of like your political philosophy, or sort of like really like doubling down on sort of like your politics. It seems like that politics is going to be sort of like maybe playing a bigger role in your life, especially with the solar eclipse in your ninth house in Aries. Again, sort of like kicking off a new phase when it comes to sort of like, maybe you will be getting involved politically in a way that you never have been. If you're sort of like upset with the way things are going, it looks like you all are maybe some of the first who could potentially be like taking to, the streets with signs or something, you know what I mean? That's like a very ninth house kind of thing. And that's being very like activated for you all right now. Mars being retrograde and stationing in your 12th house has also been one of the like trickier times, but now it seems like, the hurdle has really been like gotten over. Those 12th house, tricky 12th house things that you can deal with, sort of like the mental health and kind of like, even like paranoia and stuff that might have been coming up with Mars retrograde in Cancer in your 12th house, look like they could, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and you could be sort of like, finally like moving on from that. So yeah, it's kind of like a mixed bag. Like the eclipses in the 12th, the second and the 8th, it is speaking of sort of like heavier, sort of, more intense like money matters, but does look good with Mars going direct, and the ninth house activity looks like it could be very energetic as well. So, best of luck. Take care. Okay, Virgo rising. This is a big lunar eclipse for you this month because it's happening in those angular first and seventh houses, some of the most important fundamental houses on the cardinal cross in astrology. And it's the south node lunar eclipse in your first house, which does speak to a sort of like moving away from the first house things, which is basically like yourself. So you all could potentially have been in a period these past number of years where you were sort of like more focused on, getting yourself together and making sure like you're okay and that like your life is on track, you know what I mean? Which is all like amazing. It's like completely necessary for all of us to do that. But it does look like maybe there's now an impulse coming in to sort of move toward the other. So maybe like if you have been looking in, seeing people, or there is sort of some kind of important relationship or relationships in your life, it does look like that could maybe be taking on a bigger role in your life now. And you might be in a position now to sort of like give more of your focus onto them, the other people, which is, something that can come naturally to very Virgo people anyway. but not too much. But it does look like that could be something like that is sort of coming through for you now, and could be done in like a positive way. And as well, kind of like linked into the 8th house things, because, Venus is going retrograde in your 8th house. So kind of like a reevaluation of sort of other people's money, taxes, debt, that kind of thing, is somehow linked into all of that as well. But it does look like there could be like more of a focus coming for you now of sort of like on other people, other sort of close people in your life for whatever reason. So yeah, best of luck. Take care. Okay, last but not least is our Libra rising friends. Libra rising, you all have also been having some of perhaps maybe the most frustrating times with the Mars retrograde, because it's been in your 10th house. So what that looks like is that, Mars being so long in Cancer and then so long retrograding, and then now, still going to be there a while. It looks like maybe you started something back last year that was, maybe even like an important sort of like public thing, a career thing, a big job thing, something that you started and you were maybe planning to get done on a shorter time scale, but for whatever reason was sort of like delayed for whatever reason. That's very like Mars retrograde in the 10th house kind of thing. And, it might just now sort of be getting back on track. It might have taken a lot longer than you thought it was going to take. But Mars is going direct now, so it does look like those things could be like finally getting back on track and sort of coming to fruition. So yeah, it does seem like there could be more sort of energy or constructive development when it comes to, I hate to even say like career developments, because career to me, it's like a very almost like regressive term at this point. It feels very like 20th century, sort of like, my name's Billy Jones and I'm going to start my career, and then I'm going to retire in 40 years. It feels very kind of like we're not really like living in like a career person world anymore. I mean, some people are, but like I just feel like we're really moving away from that. Probably for a good thing. So I don't say like positive developments in your career, but more just sort of like however you are publicly in the world, outside of your home, basically. Whatever people sort of know you as or know you for, or sort of however you interact with people on sort of like a very sort of public way. The 10th house is the most public part of the chart. So that, it's the top of the chart. So it's just like, in whatever way you are sort of like in the world, in the public, marketplace, you could say, the bazaar, you just sort of like, whatever you do in the world, for whatever reason, it does look like it could be sort of like more momentum coming into that now. The lunar eclipse is happening in your 12th house, 12th and 6th house. So it does look like, if you have been sort of dealing with, any kind of like 12th house things, like, even like maybe some struggles with kind of like, the 12th house is a harder house, is a tricky house. Can be like, exile, or, feeling sort of like isolated. If you've been in a period where you felt very like isolated for whatever reason, it does look like, that could be coming to an end, which could be like a very great thing, if that's sort of the situation you've been in. The Venus-Mercury retrograde and your 7th house does speak to kind of like some kind of reevaluation when it comes to other people, close relationships, close friends, partnerships. Could be for the better, could be for the worse, but does feel like some kind of emphasis coming on to the partner, the relationship, the close friend, and could be, even tied into sort of like that culmination of the 12th house things, maybe sort of like feeling isolated in a relationship, that kind of thing. I don't know, just like one thing came to my mind, throwing it out there. Yeah, so it does look like, if you have been in sort of like a more challenging time, there are these, aspects that look like they could be sort of like coming through to sort of like offer more energy and a helping hand, especially with the like sort of public things, the things you do in public. So I wish you the best and take care. Alright, so that's all I have for this video. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. And I'm just going to end by saying, what I think I'm probably going to end up saying every time here is that, it's a crazy, crazy world. So keep your heads up and keep surfing the stars.